Hey everyone! In this video, we are finally tackling modern doctor in ancient times, building a medical empire from scratch, and trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. Quick roll call before we dive in, drop a comment with your city and what time you're watching. If you're ready for the adventure, hit that like button, subscribe to join the family, and let's get started. Imagine standing in a sterile white room. The air smells of antiseptic and ozone. The hum of machines is the only sound, a rhythmic beeping that signifies life. This was the world of Dr. Elias Thorne. Elias wasn't just a doctor, he was the chief of trauma surgery at one of New York's busiest hospitals. He was a man of science, a man who believed in what he could touch, cut, and suture. He dealt in blood, adrenaline, and the cold, hard facts of modern medicine. He had spent 20 years building a reputation as the man who could cheat death. But Elias was about to learn that death doesn't always play by the rules. And sometimes the only way to move forward is to go back, way back. It happened on a Tuesday, a rainy, miserable Tuesday. Elias had just finished a 14-hour shift. He was exhausted, his hands trembling slightly, not from nerves, never from nerves, but from pure fatigue. He walked to his car in the parking garage, the silence of the night wrapping around him. He turned the key, the engine roared to life, and he pulled out onto the slick streets. He remembered the headlights. Bright, blinding twin suns rushing toward him from a truck that had drifted across the center line. He remembered the sound of crunching metal, the shattering of glass, and then nothing, just a void. A deep, heavy darkness that felt like it lasted for a century, but he didn't die. At least not completely. When Elias opened his eyes, the sterile smell of the hospital was gone. Instead, the air was thick with the scent of dust, manure, and burning wood. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was replaced by the chaotic noise of a bustling crowd, shouts in a language that sounded vaguely Latin, the clanging of metal, the braying of animals. He tried to sit up, but his body felt wrong, lighter, weaker. His hands, his surgeon's hands, insured for millions, were rough, calloused, and covered in dirt. He looked down. He wasn't wearing his scrubs. He was wearing a coarse, beige tunic made of rough linen. Sandals made of woven straw were on his feet. "Get up, you lazy cur." A voice boomed, followed by the sharp crack of a whip hitting the dirt inches from his face. Elias scrambled back, his heart pounding against his ribs. He looked up to see a man towering over him, a brute with a thick beard, wearing leather armor and holding a whip. This wasn't New York. This wasn't a hospital. Elias looked around. He was in a market square, but the architecture was archaic, stone pillars, thatched roofs, open fires. The sun beat down with an intensity he wasn't used to. Where am I?" Elias croaked. His voice sounded different, younger. The brute laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're in the slave markets of Orinth, boy, and if you don't stand up, you'll be dead meat before the auction even starts." Orinth. The name meant nothing to him, but the reality was setting in fast. The truck, the crash. He had died. And somehow, impossibly, he was here. He checked his body again. No scars from the surgery he had as a child. No gray hairs. He looked at his reflection in a puddle of muddy water nearby. The face staring back wasn't the 45-year-old Dr. Thorne. It was a young man, barely 20, with wild hair and frightened eyes. He had inhabited the body of a slave. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but the doctor in him took over. Assessed the situation, triage, stabilize. He was in a hostile environment. He had no resources. He was considered property, but he still had his mind. He still had the knowledge of 21st century medicine locked inside the brain of this ancient nobody. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the front of the market. The crowd parted as a procession of soldiers in gleaming bronze armor marched through. In the center was a chariot carrying a man dressed in fine silks, a nobleman clearly, but the nobleman wasn't looking regal. He was clutching his chest, his face turning a terrifying shade of purple. He was gasping for air, making high-pitched wheezing sounds. The chariot halted abruptly. "A healer." "Get a healer," one of the soldiers screamed. An old man with a long gray beard, carrying a bag of dried herbs and strange amulets, rushed forward. This was the local doctor. Elias watched, his analytical mind kicking into high gear. The nobleman was exhibiting classic signs, clutching the throat, stridor, cyanosis. He was choking. It was a total airway obstruction. The old healer began chanting and waving a bundle of burning sage over the choking man. "The spirits of the air are angry," the healer proclaimed. "We must appease them with the smoke." Elias watched in horror. The man was dying. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before hypoxic brain injury set in. The smoke was doing nothing but irritating the man's eyes. "He's not possessed, you idiot," he's choking. Elias shouted, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. The brute with the whip turned to him. "Silence, slave." But Elias was already moving. The instinct to save a life was stronger than the fear of the whip. He scrambled to his feet and shoved past the brute, sprinting toward the chariot. The soldiers drew their swords, blocking his path. "Let me through, I can save him," Elias yelled, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "Get back, filth." A soldier growled, pointing a spear at Elias' throat. Behind the soldiers, the nobleman collapsed to the floor of the chariot, his eyes rolling back. The old healer was now trying to pour water down the choking man's throat, a death sentence. "Don't give him water, you'll drown him." Elias screamed. He looked the captain of the guard in the eye. "Look at him, he's turning blue. If he dies, his blood is on your hands because you stopped the only person who knew what to do. Let me pass." Something in Elias' voice, the authority of a chief surgeon who had commanded trauma teams for decades, cut through the soldier's discipline. The captain hesitated, then lowered his spear. "If he dies, you die first," the captain hissed. Elias didn't waste a second. He vaulted onto the chariot. He shoved the old healer aside. "Get out of the way." He grabbed the nobleman from behind, wrapping his arms around the man's waist. He made a fist with one hand, placed it just above the navel, grabbed it with his other hand, and pulled inward and upward with a sharp, violent thrust. The Heimlich maneuver, a technique so basic in the modern world that children learned it, but here it was sorcery. Nothing happened. The man was dead weight. "He is killing Lord Cassius," the old healer shrieked. "He is crushing his spirit." "Shut up." Elias gritted his teeth. He adjusted his grip and thrust again, harder. He felt the nobleman's ribs strain against his arms. "Come on," Elias thought, "pop out." One more thrust. Violent, desperate, hack. A piece of unchewed meat the size of a golf ball dislodged from the nobleman's windpipe and flew out of his mouth, landing on the dusty ground. The nobleman gasped, a huge, desperate intake of air that sounded like a roar. The purple hue began to fade from his face. He coughed, retched, and then took another deep breath, his lungs filling with sweet oxygen. The market fell silent. The soldiers lowered their swords. The old healer stared, his mouth agape, looking from the piece of meat on the ground to Elias. Elias stepped back, his chest heaving. He wiped sweat from his forehead with his dirty arm. He checked the nobleman's pulse. Rapid but strong. The airway was clear. Lord Cassius looked up at Elias, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He rubbed his bruised throat. "You," he rasped, "you pulled the demon from my throat with your bare hands." Elias shook his head, his breathing returning to normal. "Not a demon, just dinner. You didn't chew your meat properly." The captain of the guard stepped forward, looking at Elias with a new expression. It wasn't respect, not yet. It was calculation. "Who are you, slave? Who taught you the arts of the body?" Elias looked at the crowd. He saw the brute who owned him, looking terrified that he had almost whipped the man who just saved a noble. He saw the old healer, fuming with jealousy. And he saw the nobleman who was now looking at Elias like he was a gift from the gods. "My name is Elias," he said, standing tall in his rags, "and I am a doctor." Lord Cassius stood up, shaky but alive. He looked at the brute. "How much for this one?" The brute stammered. "My lord, he is troublesome." "I didn't ask for his character," Cassius snapped. "I asked for his price." 50 silver coins, the brute said, naming a price 3 times the standard rate. "Done," Cassius said. He tossed a heavy purse to the brute. Then he turned to Elias. "You are no longer a market slave, Elias. You belong to House Cassius now, and my wife. She has been sick for many moons. The healers say she is cursed, but if you can pull demons from throats, perhaps you can break curses too." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. He had survived the first hour. He had saved a life with a Heimlich maneuver, but now he was being thrown into the deep end. He had no antibiotics, no x-rays, no anesthesia, and no labs. He was about to face a medical mystery in a world where a fever was treated with leeches and prayers. He looked at his hands again. They were dirty, but they were steady. He had built a career on solving the unsolvable. He was a modern doctor in an ancient world, and he was just getting started. As he climbed into the chariot, leaving the stunned crowd behind, Elias knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just going to survive in this time. He was going to change it. But as the chariot rolled toward the high walls of the noble's estate, Elias noticed the old healer watching him from the shadows, eyes narrowing with a dark, dangerous hate. Saving the noble was the easy part. Surviving the politics of an ancient empire. That was going to require a very different kind of surgery. The iron gates of the Cassius estate loomed over us, casting long, imposing shadows in the dying light of the afternoon sun. As the chariot rattled over the cobblestones, entering the courtyard, I felt a strange sense of dissonance. To my right, marble statues of forgotten gods stood in perfect, stoic silence. To my left, servants scurried about, throwing buckets of slop into open drains that ran right alongside the kitchen. The smell was a punch to the gut, rotten vegetables, stagnant water, and human waste. In my old life, in the sterile corridors of New York Presbyterian, a single drop of unsterilized fluid could shut down an operating room. Here, filth was just part of the landscape. Lord Cassius leaped from the chariot before it even came to a full stop. He was a man possessed by worry. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Come, Elias," he said. "If you can save me, you can save her. But be warned, the other physicians, they are men of great renown. They will not welcome a slave telling them their business." I didn't answer. I was too busy calculating. I needed alcohol. I needed boiling water. I needed a clean blade. I had none of these things. I was walking into a medical emergency with nothing but my two hands and a brain full of knowledge that didn't belong in this century. We swept through the grand hallways, the sound of our sandals echoing off the stone walls. As we approached the master bedroom, the smell hit me again. But this wasn't the smell of the street. It was the smell of sickness, sweet, cloying, and metallic, the smell of gangrene and fever sweat. Cassius pushed open the heavy oak doors. The room was dark, the heavy velvet drapes drawn tight to block out the sun. In the center of the room lay a massive bed, and upon it, a woman who looked more like a ghost than a person, Lady Alara. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, but her skin was the color of parchment. Her breath came in shallow, rattling gasps. Standing around the bed were three men in long, dark robes. One of them was the old healer from the market, the one whose cure I had interrupted. He looked up, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom when he saw me. "What is this?" The oldest of the three boomed. "Cassius, why do you bring a market slave into the chamber of the dying?" "She is not dying," Cassius roared, his voice cracking with emotion. "He is a healer. He saved my life in the square today." The old healer scoffed. "He dislodged a piece of meat, my lord." "That is a trick of a midwife, not the art of medicine. Lady Alara is afflicted by an imbalance of the humors. Her blood is too hot. We must drain it to cool her down." I stepped forward, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. I saw a bowl next to the bed filled with dark, thick blood. They had been bleeding her. In her condition, with her heart rate likely sky high and her blood pressure tanking, bleeding her was murder. "Stop," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was hard, cold. It was the voice I used when a junior resident was about to make a fatal error. The room went silent. The three physicians looked at me as if a dog had just started reciting poetry. "You speak out of turn, slave," the old healer hissed. I ignored him. I walked to the window and ripped the drapes open. Sunlight flooded the room, revealing the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. "You are killing her," I said, walking toward the bed. "Fresh air is not a curse. It is life." I looked at Lady Alara. Her eyes were glazed, fever-bright. I placed the back of my hand against her forehead. She was burning up, at least 104 degrees. I moved my hand to her wrist. Her pulse was thready and racing, tachycardia. She was in septic shock. I pulled the blanket down. The physicians gasped in scandalized horror, but I didn't care. I needed to find the source. There on her left leg, just below the knee, was a bandage. It was filthy, stained with yellow and green pus. "What happened here?" I asked, pointing to the leg. "She fell from her horse 2 weeks ago," Cassius whispered, standing behind me. "A small cut." The physician stitched it up. I looked at the stitching. It was done with thick, coarse thread. The skin around the wound was angry, red, and swollen tight like a balloon ready to burst. Red streaks were tracking up her thigh, lymphangitis. The infection was spreading to her blood. "Who stitched this?" I asked, looking at the three men. "I did," the old healer said, puffing out his chest. "With the finest silk blessed by the high priest." "And did you boil the needle?" I asked. "Did you wash your hands?" "Boil the needle," the man laughed. "Why would I boil a needle? It would ruin the temper of the metal. And my hands are clean, boy. I wiped them on my tunic before I began." I felt a surge of rage so pure it almost blinded me. This was the enemy, not a virus, not a bacteria, but ignorance. Arrogant, deadly ignorance. I turned to Cassius. My lord, your wife has a pocket of poison inside her leg. These men sowed the dirt inside the wound. The poison has nowhere to go, so it is entering her blood. If we do not open this wound and drain it, she will be dead by sunrise. Lies, the old healer shouted. The wound is sealed. To open it is to invite the demons back in. Cassius looked from the healer to me. He was terrified. This was his world, his beliefs, and I was asking him to overturn everything he knew. Elias, Cassius said, his voice trembling. These men treat the emperor. You are nobody. I looked Cassius dead in the eye. I am the man who pulled the meat from your throat when they chanted spells. Do you want to listen to chants, or do you want your wife to live? The silence stretched for an agonizing 10 seconds. The only sound was Lady Alara's ragged breathing. Cassius closed his eyes, then opened them. He drew his sword and pointed it at the three physicians. Step back, let him work. This is madness, the old healer screamed. You will kill her, get out, Cassius roared. The physicians fled, muttering curses, leaving me alone with the Lord and his dying wife. I took a deep breath. Now came the hard part. Cassius, I need you to be strong, I said. I need boiling water, lots of it. I need clean linen cloths, not the ones used for cleaning, I mean new ones that have never been used. And I need a knife, a small one, and fire. While the servants scrambled to fetch the items, I washed my hands. I scrubbed them in a basin of water until the skin was raw. Cassius watched me, confused. Why do you wash so much? The dirt is on the floor, not your hands. There are tiny killers, Cassius, I said, unable to stop myself from teaching. Smaller than the eye can see. They live on our skin. They live in the dirt. If they get inside the blood, they kill. He looked at his hands, then at me, clearly thinking I was insane, but he didn't stop me. When the knife arrived, I held it over the flame of a candle until the metal glowed red. Sterilization. Primitive but effective. Hold her leg, I commanded Cassius. This is going to hurt, and she is going to scream. I didn't have anesthesia. I didn't have morphine. I looked at the beautiful, dying woman and whispered, I am sorry. I brought the knife down. I didn't hesitate. I cut through the old stitches, slicing into the swollen, red skin. Lady Alara's eyes flew open. She let out a scream that curdled the blood, a sound of pure, raw agony. Cassius flinched, tears streaming down his face, but he held her leg down with all his strength. As the incision opened, the pressure released. A fountain of foul-smelling, yellow-green pus erupted from the wound. The smell was horrific, filling the room instantly. Cassius gagged, turning his head away. By the gods! What is that? That, I said, grimly working to squeeze the last of the infection out, is the demon the other doctors left behind. I worked quickly. I drained the abscess. I flushed the wound with the boiled water that had cooled slightly. I packed it with the clean linen, leaving it open so it could drain further. Lady Alara had passed out from the pain, which was a mercy. Her breathing was still shallow, but the tension in her body seemed to relax. I stepped back, my hands covered in blood and pus. I felt exhausted, the adrenaline crash hitting me hard. Is it done? Cassius whispered, looking at his unconscious wife. The poison is out, I said, wiping my hands on a clean cloth. But the battle isn't over. The fever must break. Tonight is the turning point. If she survives the night, she will live. I sat in a chair by the bed, refusing to leave. Cassius sat opposite me, his sword still drawn, watching the door as if the old healers might return with an army. For hours we waited. The sun went down. The candles burned low. I watched her chest rise and fall, counting the respirations. Every shallow breath felt like a victory. Around 3 a.m, Lady Alara stirred. She groaned softly. I leaned forward, placing my hand on her forehead. It was wet. She was sweating. The fever broke, I whispered, a smile cracking my tired face. She's sweating. The heat is breaking. Cassius rushed to the side of the bed. He took her hand and kissed it, weeping openly. You did it, he sobbed. You actually did it. I stood up, my legs stiff. I walked to the window and looked out at the moonlit estate. I had survived day 1. I had performed surgery with a knife heated in a candle flame. I had introduced the concept of germs to a Roman nobleman. But as I looked down into the courtyard, I saw a figure standing in the shadows, looking up at the window. It was the old healer. He wasn't gone, and he wasn't just angry anymore. He was plotting. I knew then that I hadn't just saved a patient. I had started a war between science and superstition. and I was outnumbered, outgunned, and centuries away from backup, but I smiled. Bring it on. The sun rose over the Cassius estate, bathing the stone walls in a soft, golden light that felt entirely at odds with the darkness of the night before. I hadn't slept. I sat in the wooden chair next to Lady Alara's bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest like a hawk watching prey. The fever had broken, yes, but the war wasn't won. I had drained the abscess, but the bacteria, Staphylococcus or Streptococcus likely, were still in her blood. Without antibiotics, she was walking a tightrope over a canyon. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering. A low groan of pain escaped her lips. The adrenaline of the surgery had worn off, and now her body was registering the trauma. I needed pain relief. I needed anti-inflammatories. And I needed something to fight the infection from the inside out. Cassius entered the room, looking as ragged as I felt. He carried a tray with bread and watered-down wine. He looked at his wife, then at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "She lives," he whispered, as if saying it too loud would break the spell. "She lives," I confirmed, standing up and stretching my stiff back. "But she is in pain, and the poison still lingers in her blood. I need supplies, Cassius. I need to go to the markets." Cassius frowned. "You cannot go. The city. There are whispers. The healers you shamed yesterday have many friends." "I don't care about their friends," I snapped, perhaps a bit too harshly. "I need willow bark, specifically the white willow, and I need garlic, pounds of it. And raw honey." "Willow bark?" Cassius looked confused. "That is a peasant's chew for toothaches. It contains salicylic acid," I said, catching myself. "It stops the pain and cools the blood. And the garlic and honey. They are the only weapons I have to kill the rest of the poison." Cassius hesitated, then nodded. "Take my personal guard. Do not go alone." I walked out into the courtyard, flanked by 2 burly soldiers. The atmosphere in the estate had changed. Yesterday, the servants looked at me with curiosity. Today, they looked at me with fear. They made the sign of the horn to ward off evil as I passed. I heard the word necromancer whispered more than once. The old healer had been busy. We arrived at the herbalist district of the city. The smell of dried spices, rotting fish, and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. I moved quickly, scanning the stalls. I found a merchant selling bundles of dried bark. "Is this white willow?" I asked, picking up a strip. The merchant snatched it back, looking at my tunic, which still bore the stains of yesterday's surgery. "I do not sell to the cursed one," he spat. One of the guards stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "You will sell to whom Lord Cassius commands." The merchant turned pale and shoved the bundle into my hands. "Take it, just leave." I tossed a coin on the counter and moved on. I found the garlic bulbs as big as my fist, pungent and strong. I bought enough to kill a vampire army. Honey was easier to find. It was a staple. As we walked back, I saw a crowd gathered near the temple steps. Standing on a wooden crate was the old healer, his arms raised high. "He cuts the flesh." He was screaming to the crowd. "He spills the sacred blood. The gods punish us with sickness because we let this foreigner desecrate the bodies of the noble. He is not a healer. He is a sorcerer who treats with demons." The crowd murmured, angry and frightened. Someone threw a rotten cabbage that splattered against the wall near my head. "Keep walking," the guard grunted, shoving me forward. We made it back to the estate, the heavy gates closing behind us with a reassuring clang. I went straight to the kitchens. The cooks fled as soon as I entered, leaving pots boiling on the hearth. I didn't have time to comfort them. I set up my makeshift pharmacy. I took the willow bark and stripped the inner layer, chopping it finely. I boiled water and set the bark to steep. This was crude aspirin. It would taste like bitter earth, but it would bring her fever down and dull the agony in her leg. Next, the garlic. I crushed the cloves, the sharp, sulfurous smell filling the kitchen. I mixed the crushed garlic with the raw honey. Allicin from the garlic for the bacteria, and the osmotic effect of the honey to draw out moisture and prevent bacterial growth. It was a poor man's antibiotic, a primitive penicillin, but it was all I had. I carried the concoctions back to the bedroom. Lady Alara was awake, her eyes glassy with pain. She looked at me, terrified. Who are you?" she rasped. "I am the doctor," I said softly. "I am going to make the pain go away." I lifted her head and helped her drink the willow bark tea. She gagged at the bitterness but managed to swallow it. Then I took the garlic and honey paste. "This is going to taste strong," I warned, "but you must eat it. It is the medicine that fights the poison." She ate it, grimacing. "Now we wait," I said to Cassius. An hour passed, then 2. The tension in Lady Alara's face began to smooth out. Her breathing deepened, becoming less ragged. The salicylic acid was working. The pain was receding. She looked at Cassius and smiled weakly. The fire, in my leg, it is cooler. Cassius let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. He looked at me, and this time there was no calculation in his eyes, only pure gratitude. You are a magician, Elias, he said. I'm a scientist, I corrected him, though I knew the word meant nothing to him. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house. The sound of shouting voices drifted up from the courtyard. Cassius stood up, his hand going to his sword. Stay here. He stormed out of the room. I went to the window and peered through the slats. The courtyard was filling with people, not just a few angry peasants, but a mob. And at the front, leading them, were 5 priests in red robes, flanked by the old healer. We demand the sorcerer. The old healer shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the house. He has defiled the natural order. The gods demand justice. I watched as Cassius walked out onto the steps, alone, facing the mob. There is no sorcerer here. Cassius bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Only a man who saved my wife when your prayers failed. He bewitched you, a priest shouted. He has used necromancy to animate her corpse. Bring her out. Let us see if she is truly alive, or if she is a puppet of the dark arts. My heart hammered in my chest. If they saw her now, weak and pale, they would claim she was a zombie. If I went out there, they would tear me apart. I looked at Alara. She was watching me, fear returning to her eyes. They want you, she whispered. They want to be right, I said grimly. They are afraid of what they don't understand. I knew I couldn't hide in the room forever. I had to prove them wrong. Not with words, but with evidence. I looked at the bowl of garlic paste. I looked at the clean bandages. I turned to Alara. My lady, can you stand? She looked shocked. Stand. I cannot even lift my head. If you do not stand, if you do not walk to that window and show them you are alive and whole, they will burn this house down with us inside, I said, my voice urgent. I helped her sit up. She cried out in pain, but she gritted her teeth. I wrapped her arm around my shoulder. Lean on me, I said. We are going to show them. Step by painful step, we moved toward the balcony doors that overlooked the courtyard. Cassius was down there, his sword drawn now, the guards forming a line behind him. The mob was surging forward, rocks beginning to fly. I kicked the doors open. The sudden noise caused the crowd to look up. I stood there, supporting Lady Alara. The sunlight hit us. I wasn't wearing robes or chanting. I was just a man in a dirty tunic holding a woman who was supposed to be dead. Lady Alara took a deep breath. She looked down at the old healer who stood with his mouth open. I am alive. She screamed, her voice surprisingly strong, fueled by the adrenaline of fear. And I am hungry. The silence that followed was deafening. The mob looked from the corpse to the healer. The narrative of necromancy shattered in the face of a woman demanding lunch. I looked down at the old healer and locked eyes with him. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stared. Go home, Cassius shouted, before I arrest every single one of you for treason. Slowly, the mob began to disperse. The priests looked at each other, confused, and turned away. The old healer stood alone for a moment, his power evaporating like mist in the sun. He shot me one last look, a look that promised this wasn't over, and disappeared into the crowd. I helped Alara back to the bed where she collapsed, exhausted but triumphant. I sat down, my hands shaking. I had won the battle. I had saved the patient and dispersed the mob. But as I looked at the primitive tools around me, I realized something terrifying. I had exposed myself. I was no longer just a slave. I was a target, and if I wanted to survive, I couldn't just be a doctor anymore. I had to build a fortress. I needed a hospital. I needed students. I needed an empire of science to protect me from the empire of superstition. Cassius walked back into the room, sheathing his sword. He looked at me, a strange light in his eyes. They will come back, Elias. Eventually. I know, I said. Then we must be ready, Cassius said. You need a proper workspace. You need gold. You need legitimacy. I looked up at him. I need to open a school, I said. If I am the only one who knows this, I am a witch. If I teach 100 men to do this, it becomes science. Cassius smiled, a wolfish grin. A medical empire. I like the sound of that. We didn't build a hospital, not at first. We built a fortress of cleanliness in a city of filth. Cassius gave me an old, derelict bathhouse on the edge of his estate. It was perfect. It had the infrastructure for water, lead pipes connecting to the city's aqueduct, but it had been abandoned for years. To the Romans, it was a ruin. To me, it was a blank canvas. I spent the first week acting more like an architect than a doctor. I drove the laborers insane. I made them scrub the stone floors with vinegar and sand until the original mosaic tiles shone like new. I made them whitewash the walls, not for aesthetics, but because white showed dirt. If there was a speck of grime, I wanted to see it. The plumbing was the biggest challenge. The Roman system was designed for communal soaking, a bacterial soup. I didn't want stagnant pools. I wanted flowing water. I designed a system of copper basins where water flowed constantly from a high tap to a low drain, operated by a foot pedal I sketched out on a piece of parchment. Hands-free washing. The laborers looked at the diagram like it was an alien artifact, but they built it. When the first stream of clear water flowed into the basin without anyone touching a handle, I felt a surge of pride that rivaled any successful surgery. But a clean room is useless without tools. My hands could only do so much. I needed steel that could cut, clamp, and retract. I needed the extensions of a surgeon's will. Cassius took me to the iron district to meet a man named Vulcan. He was a blacksmith who made swords for the legions, massive, heavy blades designed to hack through bone and armor. He was a giant of a man, his skin permanently stained with soot, his arms like tree trunks. He looked at the small wax models I had carved with skepticism. "You want tweezers," Vulcan grunted, holding up the model of my hemostats, locking forceps used to clamp bleeding vessels. "These are for plucking eyebrows, slave. They are for stopping blood," I corrected. "And they need a hinge here, a locking mechanism." Click, click. "It needs to hold tight enough to crush a vein but release with a flick of a thumb." Vulcan laughed. "Metal doesn't do that. Metal hits. Metal cuts. Metal protects. Metal doesn't." Click. "It does if you are a master," I challenged him. "Can you do it, or should I find a jeweler?" The insult worked. Vulcan's pride flared. "I can forge a fly's wing if I choose to. Come back in 3 days. 3 days later, I held the first pair of surgical forceps ever made in the ancient world. They were crude by modern standards, heavy iron rather than stainless steel, prone to rusting if not oiled immediately, but they worked. They clicked. I also had a scalpel, not a sword, but a small, delicate blade, razor-sharp with a weighted handle for balance. It felt good in my hand. It felt like power. I didn't have to wait long to use them. The patient wasn't a noble this time. It was an investment. Cassius summoned me to the training grounds the following afternoon. Lying on a straw mat in the dust was Titan. Titan was a gladiator, a mountain of muscle and scars, the prize fighter of Cassius's ludus. He was worth a fortune in gold. But right now, the giant was curled into a fetal ball, weeping like a child. He was vomiting bile. His skin was clammy. I knelt beside him. "Where is the pain?" I asked. Titan pointed a trembling finger to his lower right abdomen. I pressed down gently on his left side. He groaned. Then I pressed deeply on the right lower quadrant, McBurney's point, and let go suddenly. Titan screamed and nearly punched me, his body seizing in agony. "Rebound tenderness. It's the worm in the gut," the trainer said, spitting on the ground. "He ate bad pork. We gave him emetics to make him vomit, but he gets worse." "Stop the emetics," I ordered. "You're trying to burst him." I looked at Cassius. "It's his appendix. A small pouch in the gut. It's infected and swollen. It's about to explode. If it bursts, poison fills his belly and he dies in agony within days. Can you fix it?" Cassius asked, looking at his prize fighter with concern that was purely financial. "I have to cut him open," I said. "I have to go inside his stomach and cut the pouch out." The trainer laughed. "Cut open a man's gut. He'll die of the shock. You let the humors balance." "If I don't cut him, he is dead by tomorrow," I said flatly. "Bring him to the bathhouse." Now, this was it. The inaugural surgery of the world's first sterile hospital. We laid Titan on a high wooden table I had commissioned, covered in boiled linen sheets. The room was flooded with afternoon light. I had my tools, the heavy iron forceps, the scalpel, the needle and silk thread. I didn't have anesthesia. That was the nightmare. I had a mixture of opium, mandrake root, and strong wine. We poured it down Titan's throat until his eyes went glassy and his slurring speech stopped. It wasn't unconsciousness. It was just a haze. "Tie him down," I commanded. "Tight. If he moves, I nick an artery and he bleeds out." 4 men held the gladiator's limbs. I washed my hands at my foot pedal sink, scrubbing for a full 5 minutes while they watched in confused silence. I donned a clean apron. I picked up the scalpel. The iron felt cold. "Hold him," I yelled. I made the incision. Titan didn't scream. The opium was doing its work, but his body bucked against the restraints. The abdominal muscles were thick, tough like leather. I had to slice through the skin, then the layer of fat, then the fascia. Blood welled up. "Sponge," I ordered. One of the servants, terrified but trained by me over the last week, dabbed the wound with a boiled cloth. I used the retractors, curved pieces of iron, to pull the muscle apart. I couldn't cut the muscle, that would end his career. I had to separate the fibers. I reached inside. It was hot. My fingers navigated the slippery, pulsing organs of a living man. This was blind surgery. I couldn't see much, I had to feel. I traced the colon down there. I felt it. A swollen, hot sausage-like mass. It was huge, minutes away from rupturing. "I have it," I whispered. I pulled the appendix up through the incision. It was angry red and covered in fibrin. The trainer, who was watching from the corner, retched and turned away. Cassius watched with a morbid fascination, his face pale. Now the test. I took Vulcan's forceps. I clamped the base of the appendix. Click. The sound was the sweetest thing I had ever heard. The flow of blood stopped. The clamp held. I took the needle and silk thread. I tied off the base of the organ, my knots practiced and secure. Then I took the scalpel and sliced the infected organ free. I dropped the rotting appendix into a metal bowl. It landed with a wet thud. The hard part was over. Now the closure. I sutured the stump. I checked for bleeding. The cavity was dry. I let the muscles snap back together and began sewing the skin. Titan was snoring now, the pain stimulus gone. I stepped back, dropping the bloody tools onto a tray. I stripped off my gloves. Well, I didn't have gloves, so I went straight to the sink and scrubbed the blood from my skin until the water ran clear. "He will sleep for a day," I told Cassius. "When he wakes up, he will be sore. But the pain, the killing pain, is gone." Cassius looked at the piece of rotting flesh in the bowl. "You took that out of him. It was killing him," I said. "Now it's trash." I looked around the room. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the white tiles. The air still smelled of vinegar and ozone, mixed now with the copper scent of blood. It wasn't the stainless steel operating theater of New York, but it was a start. That night Titan woke up. He didn't scream. He asked for water. By the next morning he was sitting up. The rumors started spreading by noon. The slave doctor didn't just use herbs. He opened men up and took out their demons, then sewed them back together. I stood on the steps of my new hospital, watching the city below. I had the tools, I had the facility, I had the first success. But as I watched, I saw a chariot arriving at the main gates of the estate. It bore the crest of the governor. Cassius came running out to meet me, looking frantic. "Elias," he gasped. "The governor has heard." "Is he sick?" I asked. "No," Cassius said, his face grave. "He isn't sick. He wants to know why a slave is practicing the arts of the gods without a license from the temple. He has summoned you." I looked at my hands. I had conquered the bacteria. Now I had to conquer the bureaucracy. And the governor of this province was known for two things: his lavish parties and his swift executions. I grabbed my bag of tools. "Let's go," I said. I have a feeling he's going to need more than an aspirin. The governor's palace was a different beast entirely. Where Cassius's estate was a home, this was a monument to absolute power. Marble pillars thick as redwoods held up a ceiling painted with scenes of conquest. Gold leaf glittered from every cornice. But despite the luxury, the air here felt heavier, sharper. It was the atmosphere of a place where a single wrong word could end your life. I walked into the grand audience chamber, flanked by Cassius. He was sweating, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I surprisingly was calm. Panic is a physiological reaction, a dump of cortisol and adrenaline. I had learned to suppress it years ago in the ER. When a patient is bleeding out, you don't panic, you work. This was just another trauma case. Only the patient was the political system, and the bleeding was my own potential execution. Governor Valerius sat on a throne of ivory and silk. He was a massive man, obese by the standards of the time, his face flushed red, his fingers adorned with rings that looked tight enough to cut off circulation. Standing next to him was a man in crimson robes, the high priest. Not the local healer from the market, but the head of the temple. This was the big leagues. The high priest, a man named Malachi with eyes like polished obsidian, spoke first. "This is the slave governor, the one who mocks the gods. He slices into the sacred vessel of the body. He claims dominion over life and death. He practices the dark arts." Valerius looked at me with bored, watery eyes. He swirled a goblet of wine in his hand. "Is this true, slave?" Do you claim to be a god? I stepped forward, bowing low but keeping my chin up. I claim to be a student of nature, Governor, nothing more. I do not use magic. I use the laws of the world that the gods created. To ignore those laws is the true insult. Malachi sneered. Laws. You boil iron, you sew flesh like a seamstress. You claim invisible demons live in the air. This is madness. It is heresy. Governor Valerius leaned forward, wincing as he shifted his weight. His left foot was propped up on a velvet cushion. I noticed that immediately. The joint of the big toe was swollen, angry red, and shiny. Even the weight of a silk sheet would be agonizing. Podagra, I thought. Gout. The disease of kings. Governor, I said, my voice steady. The high priest speaks of faith. I speak of results. I saved Lord Cassius's wife when prayers failed. I saved his gladiator when the emetics were killing him. Luck, Malachi spat. A demon's luck. I ignored him and looked directly at the governor. I see you are in pain, Excellency. Valerius froze. The room went silent. To mention the governor's weakness was taboo. My foot, Valerius grunted. It is. A persistent injury from an old campaign. It is not an injury, I said boldly. It is a fire in the blood. It comes after you eat rich meats, drink sweet wine, or consume organ meats. The pain is worst at night. It feels as though a dog is gnawing on your toe. Valerius's eyes widened. He set the wine goblet down. You describe it exactly. The physicians say it is a curse from Bacchus. It is uric acid, I said, using the Latin term for sharp salts. Your body produces crystals like tiny shards of glass that settle in the joint. It is a mechanical problem, not a spiritual one. Malachi stepped in, sensing his influence slipping. He guesses. He spies on the kitchens. Governor, demand a test. If he is a man of science, let him prove his power over the elements right here, right now. If he fails, let him burn. Valerius nodded slowly. A test. Yes. Show me a miracle, slave, but not a healing. Healings can be faked. Show me you control the elements. I looked around the room. I needed a reaction, something visible, something exothermic. I didn't have my lab. I didn't have chemicals. I scanned the room. Then I saw it. In the corner, a servant was mixing mortar for a loose tile. He had a bucket of water and a sack of white powder, quicklime, calcium oxide. I smiled. Bring me that sack of white stone, I pointed, and a bucket of cold water, and a raw egg. The court whispered. Malachi crossed his arms, looking smug. He thinks he can bake a cake to save his life. The servant brought the items. I placed the bucket in the center of the marble floor. Observe, I announced. The high priest says fire belongs only to the gods. He says heat requires wood and flame, but nature holds heat inside the stone if you know how to ask for it. I took the sack of quicklime. It looked like harmless chalk. I poured a generous amount into the bucket of cold water. I held up the raw egg. I'm going to cook this egg in cold water, I said. I dropped the egg into the bucket. For a moment, nothing happened. Malachi opened his mouth to laugh. Then the water began to hiss. Bubbles rose to the surface. A plume of steam erupted from the bucket. The water began to churn violently, rolling and boiling as if it were sitting on a bonfire. The heat radiating from the bucket was intense, an exothermic reaction releasing energy as the calcium oxide turned into calcium hydroxide. The courtiers gasped and stepped back. Valerius leaned forward, his mouth agape. Fire from water, someone shouted. I waited 2 minutes, the steam billowing around me like a stage effect. Then I used a ladle to fish the egg out. I cracked it open on the rim of the bucket. It was hard-boiled. I walked up to the throne and offered the egg to the governor. It is hot, Excellency, I warned. Valerius took the egg gingerly. He peeled it and took a bite. He looked at Malachi, then at me. You summoned fire from a rock, Valerius said, chewing thoughtfully. Without a flint, without a spark. Chemistry, Governor, I said, not magic. Knowledge. Valerius laughed, a deep booming sound. I like this chemistry. It could be useful. Imagine heating the baths without wood. Imagine boiling oil to pour on enemies without needing a fire pit. He looked at Malachi. The slave stays. Malachi's face was a mask of fury, but he bowed stiffly. As you wish, Governor, but be warned. Knowledge without reverence is a dangerous thing. Malachi stormed out, his robe swirling. I knew I had made a powerful enemy for life, but I had survived. Valerius turned back to me. Now, about my foot. You said you know what causes it. Can you stop it? I can, I said, but the cure is bitter. You must drink a tea made from the autumn crocus flower. It is poison if you take too much, so only I can dose it. And you must stop drinking sweet wine and eating organ meats. Valerius's face fell. No wine, less wine, I negotiated, and more water. If you do this, the glass shards in your toe will dissolve. You will walk without a cane in 3 days. Valerius considered it. If I walk in 3 days, I will grant you a license to practice. I will give you the protection of the governor's seal. No priest will touch you, but he leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. If you are wrong and I am still in pain, I will have you boiled in that bucket of yours. I nodded. Deal. We left the palace an hour later. Cassius was practically vibrating with excitement. You are insane, he whispered as we climbed into the chariot. You threatened the governor's diet. I saved his life, I said, leaning back, exhausted. Gout causes kidney stones. Kidney failure kills. I just bought us time, Cassius. But as we rode back to the estate, my mind was already racing. I had the license. I had the funding. I had the protection. But Malachi was out there, and he wasn't going to fight me with science. He was going to fight me with the one thing I couldn't control, the people's fear. I needed to expand. I needed to train students fast. I couldn't be the only doctor in the city. If I died, the knowledge died with me. Cassius, I said, tomorrow we start recruiting. I don't want servants, I want scholars. I want young men and women who can read and write. We are going to build a medical school. Cassius looked at me. A school? For what? For the future, I said. But before we could start the school, a new problem arrived. A messenger was waiting at the gates of the estate when we returned. He was covered in dust, his horse foaming at the mouth. He collapsed at my feet. Doctor, he gasped, the mines, the silver mines. What about them? I asked, kneeling to check his pulse. A sickness, he wheezed. The men are coughing blood, they are turning black, the foreman says. He says it is the plague. I froze. Pneumonic plague, anthrax. If it was a contagion, and it was in the mines, it would spread to the city in days. The medical empire I was building might just become a graveyard. Get the wagon, I told Cassius. Pack the masks. We're going to the mines. The journey to the silver mines took half a day, the road winding up into the jagged, desolate hills that bordered the province. As we climbed higher, the air grew thinner and tasted of metallic dust. The lush greenery of the valley gave way to scrub brush and gray rock. It looked like a scar on the face of the earth. Cassius rode beside me in the wagon, his face grim. He knew what mines were. In this era, a sentence to the mines was a delayed death penalty, but a plague, that was bad for business. If the silver stopped flowing, the governor's mood and his gout would return with a vengeance. We arrived at the camp just as the sun was dipping behind the peaks, casting the valley in long, bruised shadows. The camp was a shantytown of tattered tents and wooden shacks. The sound of coughing was everywhere, a dry, hacking chorus that drowned out the wind. The foreman, a man named Guido with one eye and a whip coiled at his hip, met us. He didn't look happy to see a doctor. He looked like a man trying to hide a crime scene. It is the wrath of Pluto, Guido grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near my boots. The god of the underworld is angry we dig too deep. He breathes poison on the men. Show me, I said, grabbing my bag. He led us to a large tent set apart from the others. Inside, 30 men lay on straw mats. The smell hit me instantly, rotting blood, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something acrid like burnt almonds. I knelt beside the nearest man. He was young, maybe 18. His skin was stained a deep, permanent gray from the silver dust, making him look like a statue. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving violently, but no air seemed to be getting in. He coughed and a spray of bright red, frothy blood splattered onto the straw. I checked his temperature. Normal. I checked the next man. Normal. I stood up, my mind racing. This wasn't a virus. It wasn't bacteria. Infectious diseases like the plague or smallpox cause high fevers as the immune system fights back. These men were cold. They weren't fighting an infection. They were being poisoned. Who are these men? I asked Guido. The deep diggers, Guido said. They work the new shaft. The ones up top, they are fine. Only the ones who go deep get the black curse. I walked to the entrance of the mine, a dark, gaping maw in the side of the mountain. I felt a draft of air coming out. It was warm. And it carried that same acrid smell. How do you break the rock? I asked. Fire setting, Guido explained as if I were an idiot. We build a fire against the rock face. The heat cracks the stone. Then we douse it with vinegar to shatter it. I closed my eyes inside. It was so obvious. They were building fires in a deep, unventilated shaft. The fire consumed the oxygen and released carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide from the ore. The men weren't sick, they were suffocating. They were drowning in toxic gas and inhaling silica dust that shredded their lungs. It is not a curse, Guido, I said, turning to him. It is smoke. You are smoking them like hams. Guido laughed. Smoke rises, fool. The shaft goes down. Smoke fills the space it is given. I snapped. You are killing them with bad air. I need to go down there, I told Cassius. Cassius looked at the dark tunnel. You said it's poison, you'll die. Not if I filter the air, I said. I ran back to the wagon. I needed to build a gas mask. I didn't have rubber or plastic, but I had the principles of filtration. I took several layers of thick linen. I grabbed a bag of charcoal from the camp's kitchen fire. Charcoal is carbon, and carbon binds to toxins. It was a primitive activated charcoal filter. I crushed the charcoal into a fine powder and sandwiched it between layers of wet linen. I sewed it into a mask that covered my nose and mouth, tying it tight behind my head. I looked like a bandit or a monster. I'm going in, I said, my voice muffled by the thick cloth. Guido, bring a torch, but hold it low. We descended. The tunnel was narrow, held up by rotting timber beams. The deeper we went, the hotter it got. The air grew heavy. Guido was already coughing, but the mask was working. The air I breathed was humid and smelled of wet ash, but it was breathable. 50 feet down, the torch began to flicker. Go back, I yelled to Guido. Why? The fire is dying, it's not the wind, I shouted. It's the lack of air. The fire is starving. And if the fire can't breathe, neither can the men. We reached the end of the shaft. A pile of wood was smoldering against the rock face. The smoke hung in the air, a thick gray blanket that refused to move. I grabbed a pickaxe lying on the ground and smashed the smoldering wood, scattering the embers. Then I grabbed a bucket of water standing nearby and doused it. Steam hissed and screamed in the confined space. I coughed, my eyes stinging. Even with the mask, the sulfur was burning my eyes. We need to get out, I signaled. We scrambled back up the shaft, lungs burning. When we burst out into the cool evening air, I ripped the mask off and took a deep, greedy gulp of oxygen. Guido fell to his knees, retching. You see? I gasped, pointing at the mine entrance. No God, just bad engineering. What do we do? Cassius asked. We need the silver. Ventilation, I said, wiping soot from my face. You cannot dig one hole, you must dig two. You need a second shaft connected to the first at the bottom. And you need a fire. Not at the bottom to break rock, but at the top of the second shaft. They looked at me blankly. Physics, I explained, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Hot air rises. If you build a fire at the top of the second shaft, it will suck the air up like a chimney. That suction will pull fresh air down the main shaft. You create a wind, a lung for the mountain. Guido stared at the drawing. That is a lot of digging. It will take weeks. And if you don't do it, I said, stepping close to him, my voice hard, every man you send down there will die. And when the governor asks why his silver has stopped, I will tell him it is because Guido the foreman was too lazy to dig a hole. Guido paled. The mention of the governor was enough. Dig the shaft, he grunted. I spent the next 3 days at the mine. I didn't just design the ventilation, I revolutionized their safety. I made them crush more charcoal. I set up a sewing circle with the camp women, mass-producing the charcoal masks. I mandated that every miner wear one. I also introduced wet mining. I forced them to splash water on the rock face before swinging their pickaxes. Why make the rock wet? A miner asked, looking at me like I was crazy. It makes the handle slippery. It stops the dust, I said. The dust you can't see. The dust that turns your lungs to stone. It was a battle. Every day I had to fight their habits, their superstition, and their laziness. But slowly, the coughing in the camp began to subside. The men in the plague tent, who were not too far gone, began to recover once they were breathing fresh air. On the 4th day, the new ventilation shaft was connected. We lit the fire at the top of the chimney shaft. I stood at the entrance of the main tunnel. I held up a strip of cloth. Suddenly, the cloth fluttered. Then it snapped inward. A steady, cool breeze was being sucked into the mine. It breathes, a miner whispered, watching the cloth. It works, Cassius said, grinning. I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. It was Guido. He wasn't smiling. Men like him didn't smile, but he nodded at me. You are a strange wizard slave, he grunted. You fight ghosts with wind. I am a doctor, I corrected him again. We loaded the wagon to leave. The crisis was averted. The silver would flow. But as we rode away, looking back at the scarred mountain, I felt a heavy weight in my chest. I had saved them, yes, but I had also just made the mine more efficient. I had made it possible for the governor to extract more wealth, to fuel more wars, to buy more slaves. I was using my knowledge to save lives, but the system was using my knowledge to feed its greed. Cassius saw my expression. You look sad for a man who just defeated a god. I didn't defeat a god, Cassius, I said quietly. I just built a better chimney. And I have a feeling that Malachi and the priests won't be happy that I turned a curse into a plumbing problem. I was right. Malachi wasn't just unhappy. He was desperate. I had humiliated him in the palace, and now I had disproved a divine curse at the mines. I was stripping away the mystery that gave the temple its power. As we approached the city gates, I saw a column of smoke rising from the direction of my bathhouse hospital. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped my heart. Faster, I yelled at the driver. We tore through the streets, the wagon wheels screeching. When we turned the corner to the estate, my worst fears were realized. It wasn't the hospital burning. It was a pyre in front of it. A crowd had gathered. And standing on the steps of my sanctuary, blocking the door, was a squad of temple guards. They were armed with heavy maces, and in the center of the courtyard, Malachi was holding a book. My book. The journal I had been keeping, filled with anatomy sketches, chemical formulas, and diagrams of the future. He is here, Malachi shouted as our wagon skidded to a halt. The heretic returns. He held my journal over the fire. This is not knowledge, he screamed to the crowd. This is a map of hell. He plans to cut you all open. He plans to replace your souls with his machines. I jumped from the wagon. Don't touch that. Malachi smiled, a cruel, thin smile. He let the book drop. I watched in slow motion as the heavy leather volume fell into the flames. The pages curled. The ink, my designs for antibiotics, for surgical tools, for the future of medicine, turned to ash. I stood there, frozen. That book was my lifeline. It was everything I remembered from the modern world. Malachi stepped forward. The governor protects your body, slave, but he cannot protect your words. Leave this city, or the next thing we burn will be you. I looked at the fire, then at Malachi. He thought he had destroyed me. He thought that by burning the paper, he had burned the knowledge. He didn't know that the knowledge wasn't in the book. It was in me. And now he had made a fatal mistake. He had made me angry.